And then in terms of antifungals, I think that this can be missed a lot of times. So the way that I usually explain this is whether there is something that's passed in utero or not, or if it's a current exposure, there's likely a fungus that is residing in the body. So when it's a current exposure, mold is a fungus, it produces spores, we inhale those spores, and then it starts to colonize and live within the sinuses and the GI tract. The same is true if that happened to mom, and now it got passed in utero and you started day one with that fungus in your body, knowing that we transfer the microbiome in its entirety to our children. And while we certainly do want to be selecting binders specific to the mycotoxins that are being excreted, we also want to be sure that we're addressing colonization. So the binders are a crucial component, but they are often not enough to actually do eradication of that fungus that's living somewhere in the body. So using antifungals in the GI tract in particular, or in the sinuses, can be incredibly important for making sure that this issue doesn't come back again in the future.
All right, Deidre, welcome to the Holistic Hub podcast. I'm so excited to have you as a guest today. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to chat through all this.
Yay. Well, you came on my radar because you really talk a lot about our environment and toxic chemicals and things that we can get exposed to on a daily basis that can really be impacting our hormones and our fertility. So really excited to dive deep into that with you today. But first, I like to always ask this question, like, what got you started in all this? Like, what's your story?
Yeah. So a lot of people always ask me if I had any trouble conceiving, and luckily I did not. But I have a little boy, he's 4 years old now. And when he was about 9 months old, he started developing eczema. And I couldn't figure out why, because I knew a lot about gut health at that point in time, and I had made a lot of changes to make sure that his gut health would be in a good spot. So, I hadn't used antibiotics in over 10 years. He was born at home. He was breastfed. And I was, trying to think of all the things I possibly could to create a perfect environment for his gut health to thrive. And then he started getting really bad eczema. And I was like, what am I missing here actually? And so in the process of starting to apply what we were already doing with adults to him, I figured out that a lot of the toxin burden that I had been exposed to over the course of my life and had accumulated had actually been passed to him in utero. So he got all of my toxins, and it developed in eczema for him specifically. So I started applying that more to the adults that we were working with, especially in the fertility space, and realizing that there are huge connections in toxin burden with how hormones function, with gut health, and a lot of the common factors that we see go wrong or negatively impact fertility. And as we started looking at that, it really started to all click that this is a huge part of what a lot of fertility specialists are missing. And so it's a big part of what we do now.
Wow, that's really, really amazing to hear. So do you typically then see a lot of clients that you've worked with that are struggling with fertility? Maybe they had been exposed in utero, like from their own mom, to toxins as well. Like, do you see like clients coming to you saying, I've honestly had like issues since birth. I've had symptoms since birth.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We certainly see a lot of women in particular who say, everything started changing when I went to college, or when I lived in this house, or after this point in my life, things started getting a little bit more hairy and changing with my hormones and my period and things like that. But there's a lot of people that we see who have always had gut health issues. They were a colicky baby. They've had eczema their whole life, and nobody thought to ask why that was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually see that quite a bit too. And that's why I'm really excited that you mentioned that as something that we can just state for the listeners, because there's a lot of people out there that have just been dealing with it for as long as they can remember. And they just think that it's just their norm, right? Because they've had it for their entire life. So I'd love to really dive into these different environmental pollutants and toxins that you typically see affecting the clients you work with. And you do talk a lot on your social media about mold and plastics and heavy metals. So are these the most common? Are there others that you also see that are affecting as well? And is it like typically one more than another, or an accumulation of these different ones?
Yeah, we almost never see clean toxin testing come back. Everybody has something. And the severity, I think, has a lot to do with what we've inherited from our mother, but then also exposures over the course of our life and just our inherent ability to detoxify. So we do see a lot of mold. Oftentimes this does happen as early as childhood. So, I remember living in a home as a child where we had a crawl space where there was very clear mold issues. And I could even have conversations with my mom now about all of these symptoms that she had. And it was like, we had a huge mold issue in our home, but nobody knew in the 90s. So that's a huge one that we do often see. We see a lot of women who go to college, maybe live in a dormitory or an old home where they're exposed to something as far as mold. We see a good amount of heavy metal burden, and that can vary from everything from mercury to lead, aluminum. We know that a lot of women are exposed to, but we can also see some chemicals in a lot of the women that we work with. So one of the most common ones that I do think is actually inherited over generations is DDA. And DDA is a metabolite of DDT. So those of you who don't know, DDT was a pesticide. It got banned in the 70s, and yet we're still seeing it in women born well after the 70s. So we know that this can be transferred in utero, but it also, resides in soil and water sources that we're still being exposed to today. And it has huge health implications, which is why DDT was banned back in the day.
Those persistent environmental pollutants that, yes, we think of as, they were banned many, many years ago, 56 years ago. But unfortunately, yes, still get into the irrigation, into the runoff. They can still persist in the environment and then we get exposed to them. So it's so important, like you're mentioning, to not rule out some of these toxins that we don't think we're getting exposed to now, but we absolutely could be. So that's really important. I'm curious, with toxin accumulation, obviously it can affect multiple areas of the body, but how do these different environmental chemicals actually affect fertility?
Yeah. So the way that I usually think about these type of chemicals impacting fertility is an indirect relationship. So yes, we do have things like parabens and phthalates that are direct endocrine disruptors and impact the way that hormone balance occurs in the body, which can ultimately increase things like estrogen and decrease progesterone, which is very important when we think about conception and the ability to carry to full term. But a lot of these chemicals can also impact other systems in the body that are really important for fertility. So they can impact things like gut health. We know that gut health is one of the major issues or that can negatively impact fertility because it puts stress on the body. It's going to change the way that we're able to break down and absorb nutrients, but it's also going to cause inflammation and immune dysregulation. We can see that impact things like the thyroid. So the thyroid is incredibly important when it comes to fertility. We need the thyroid to be in a pretty good spot where we're at least not in a hypothyroid state, which is most commonly what we see, but that can negatively impact the ability to conceive to term. So we see a lot of women who come in with some level of hypothyroidism, whether that is an autoimmune condition or not, and it actually has to do with the way that toxins are impacting the thyroid and its ability to function and depleting nutrients as the body essentially attempts to clean up. So the way that I usually think about hypothyroidism, especially with autoimmunity, is that the body's doing the best with what it has to offer, and it's trying to clean things up. It's not that the body is making a mistake and attacking itself, but the immune system is trying to get rid of something that is harming these endocrine glands. Or if it's impacting things like the liver is so important for blood sugar regulation, which is going to impact all hormone function in the body. It's going to impact the ability to break down fatty acids, which are so important for fertility, especially knowing that all sex hormones are derived from cholesterol. If we're not able to actually absorb cholesterol, even if we're getting enough in the diet, we don't produce sex hormones, which means that we're going to have low estrogen, low progesterone as a result. So there's a lot of ways that this can really impact us, even if it's not directly impacting our sex hormones, that our hormones are kind of the last domino in the line and a byproduct of these dysfunctional issues elsewhere throughout the body.
Yeah. And I could imagine with the people that you see that are struggling with hormone imbalances and toxic load, that they probably have seen a lot of different practitioners because they just see hormone imbalances on their blood work, or their symptoms are estrogen dominant, or, they're Googling it and they're saying, okay, like, these are my symptoms. Like, I just need to go do a Dutch test and then probably just take some supports that can help balance things out. But really not getting after that, like, that's treating like the symptom of what's occurring, which is that hormone dysregulation piece, but not really getting after what is really driving this piece. So it sounds like that's a big area that you're focusing in, which is so needed and so important, because unfortunately there's so much just here, throw this at a hormone imbalance and let's hope that it helps, because we're not really getting after like the big missing piece, the puzzle piece.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of women who come in and say, I can't get pregnant. I'd like to do hormone testing. And I hate wasting women's money. I hate wasting anybody's money on anything. And so I usually have a conversation with them about, let's say there is a hormone issue. Tell me what's happening. I have really heavy periods and really painful cramping, and I have breast tenderness before my cycle. Okay, we're probably looking at an estrogen dominant situation where estrogen is high, at least relative to progesterone. I already know that there's a hormone imbalance. So hormone testing isn't necessarily going to give us new information, because hormone testing is going to tell us that there is an issue, but it's not going to tell us why there's an issue occurring. And we have to look deeper to get those whys. And this is unfortunately, I think, where a lot of fertility clinics or even couples who have gone through IUI or IVF get it wrong, because they're looking at the reproductive system through the lens of this is the only thing that can be wrong, rather than looking at the whole body and how all of these systems interact with one another.
Yes. And I almost want to relate this like just to another scenario too. Like, for example, a lot of the women or the people that I work with that are struggling with gut issues that might have these gut issues from some form of toxic load in their body, particularly, let's just say, mold or something. And so they've gone through all like the SIBO testing, they've done the SIBO treatments, they've done everything, but nothing's really getting better. But they still want to come in and like, let's just do like all the other gut panels we can do, or another SIBO test and see what's going on. But really, what is like consistently not allowing your body to just bounce back, even if you are like maybe feeling some form of relief or some numbers are showing up as better, right? There's still a reason and something that we really want to dive deep into. And to your point, for something you were mentioning earlier about how those toxins are indirectly affecting our body. Again, if we have this toxic accumulation in our system, the last thing our body wants to do is focus on, having good hormones or focus on having good gut motility or liver detoxification. It's trying to put out these different fires. And so again, that's where the body is just going to be like, no, like we see these unfortunate consequences happen as a result of the toxic load. But again, it's really driving that point home that you are doing with the patients you work with and that you're mentioning today is let's find out like what's going on in the body and address that. So that way these downstream effects that are occurring can just start to, we can put those out. We can actually allow the body to thrive again. And so you talk a lot about heavy metals, which I'm excited to kind of dive deep into that with you today. And so which ones are we talking about, and where that you typically see most in your clinic, and where can people become exposed to these particular ones?
Yeah. So with heavy metals, there are some heavy metals that are more dangerous than others. And the thing that I always like to explain is that when we're thinking about a heavy metal burden, we may very well see toxicity of things like barium or thallium. And these are kind of our almost inescapable heavy metals that we can come in contact with. And they tend to accumulate when we have some of these big key players creating a toxicity, particularly in the liver, and the inability to eliminate them effectively. So some of the big ones that I'm usually thinking about are things like mercury, where we can be exposed to this through water sources, but we can also be exposed through things like amalgam fillings, which was the case for me. I had amalgam fillings before I got pregnant and didn't realize that it was going to be an issue for my son. We can get exposed to them through things like vaccines, but water source tends to be one of the big ones. Then we're thinking about things like lead. So lead, we tend to know, has huge health implications. Again, thinking about water sources, but it might also be things like our cookware. It can be the paint in our home, depending on the age of our home. Things like aluminum. Aluminum is one of the big ones that I often see come back elevated because women are using antiperspirants in there rather than a deodorant. So a lot of times we think about deodorant as kind of like this catch-all term, but anything that is decreasing the ability to sweat through the armpits will be containing aluminum. And we can actually absorb the aluminum through the skin in the armpits, which can be true of all skin throughout the body, but especially some of these more sensitive areas where we're actually absorbing it and creating a toxicity in our body. So one of the big areas where I do see a lot of heavy metal toxicity come through is through tap water. And I think this is one of the easiest things that we can change. It's something that I am kind of crazy about, is that I don't think anybody should be drinking tap water. I usually call it infertility water in our practice because of everything that comes in tap water. It can be heavy metals, but it can also be things like chemicals. We see a lot of pharmaceutical medications come through tap water as well, to include things like birth control and Plan B as well. So all of those are going to be impacting fertility in a big way. But the number one way that I usually see heavy metals come up is through water. So if you're drinking water, if it's tap water, well water, we want to make sure that it is a clean source and that you are continuously testing it, because things do shift over time.
Do you have a recommendation for a particular type of water filtration that you've seen work time? And, everyone's water, depending on where you live in the country, is going to be different and contain different things. But again, is there something that you've seen across the board, or maybe even in Colorado where you're based, like that seems to be the best at filtering?
Yeah. So we usually recommend doing reverse osmosis at a minimum. And depending what part of the country you live, if you live somewhere where there are more radioactive substances in the water, such as Texas, 70% of the water sources in Texas are contaminated with radioactive sources, things like radium and uranium, which is like an added layer to heavy metals. But also places like Wisconsin, there's a whole belt of area throughout Wisconsin where there are high levels of uranium. Then doing something like distillation is incredibly important, because that's the best way to remove those from the water.
Awesome. Thank you. So with heavy metals, where does the body sequester these? And I was curious too, what are some of the other symptoms of maybe this heavy metal accumulation in the body outside of infertility?
Yeah. So when we're thinking about heavy metals cause oxidative stress. And so as a protective mechanism, just like the body is trying to prevent pregnancy, as a protective mechanism, it's trying to keep us safe. It might be a crappy way to go about it, but it is just trying to keep us safe at the end of the day. Our body will sequester heavy metals in certain tissues. Most of them tend to be high in fat content. So that's going to be places like the brain or adipose tissue, or even the liver. We'll see a lot of heavy metal accumulation. And this can ultimately cause a lot of different symptoms that fall way outside of fertility. So we can see a lot of neurological symptoms, things like memory loss or tremors or numbness and tingling throughout, especially your hands or feet, irritability, mood changes as well. Sometimes we can see respiratory issues if it's more of like an acute exposure that's happening on a regular basis, but we can see a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms as well. It can be anything from nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, strange abdominal pain, having a metallic taste in your mouth, even seeing changes in bone health as well. So things like osteoporosis. A lot of heavy metals are stored in bone as a protective mechanism and a way to keep it from circulating more. And so we can see osteoporosis levels increase, especially for women when they're a little bit younger. So sometimes we'll see women come in and they're in their 30s and they've been diagnosed with osteoporosis. Well, we're already thinking about reduced bone mineral density and that there might be a heavy metal component. And the tricky thing oftentimes is that while there are some great tests for heavy metal testing, we can't test what's being stored in the bones. And that can be a good indicator that something's happening there. And sometimes we'll see some skin issues as well. So every once in a while, we'll see somebody whose primary symptom with heavy metal toxicity is eczema or dry skin or some mysterious dermatitis, sometimes hyperpigmentation, or they're just seeing a lot of sensitive skin reactions to everything that they come in contact with.
Interesting. So are you thinking, was this probably relating to your son when he was dealing with eczema and you had the heavy metal, like you had the mercury amalgam fillings, and that's what he dealt with since birth?
Yep, absolutely. Okay. And every once in a while, it's usually with children, I would say, but a lot it can happen with adults. We'll see some children who don't have things like mold and they don't have chemicals, and gut health looks pretty good, but the heavy metal burden's there. And so we're seeing it present through the skin as the body's attempting to remove it effectively.
Yes. And so that leads me to my next question then. What are the primary, what are the preferred routes of exposure that the preferred routes of excretion, I should say, that these heavy metals in particular like to get excreted out of our body?
Yeah. So the two primary ways are going to be via the bowels and via the kidneys. So knowing that I would say more people have constipation than realize that they do have constipation in some capacity. That's our primary way of eliminating everything that we come in contact with from exogenous toxin sources, but also endogenous toxins. So we often forget that our own cells have byproducts, which is essentially trash at the end of the day. Our own hormones can be toxic at high levels, and we have to be eliminating those via the bowels. So good bowel motility is crucial, but then also thinking about kidney function. So thinking about not only being hydrated, making sure that you're using minerals to actually be cellularly hydrated, and that the kidneys are in a good spot to actually be able to do that detoxification work. Not uncommon for us to see that kidneys are struggling, especially when there has been a significant toxin burden. And that, is proof by one of the main tests that we use to test for toxins is a urine test. A lot of those things are being excreted via the urinary tract, and so we have to be thinking about the impact to the kidneys.
And alongside heavy metals, I mean, mold is just something that is unfortunately on the rise now too, with like 75 to 80% of homes potentially having water damage. And that's where something else that we're getting exposed to as well, and something that you have been kind of bringing to light in your social media platform is talking about a particular one that could be affecting fertility, zearalenone. And so how can this one affect fertility? And are there other symptoms that are also associated with that being somebody's issue?
Yeah. So it is called either ZEN or ZEA. So I'm going to go with ZEN just for our purposes today. But ZEN is a mycotoxin that comes from molds, and it's a non-steroidal estrogenic mycotoxin, meaning that the body perceives it as an estrogen mimicker, very similar to an endocrine disruptor. So often what we'll see is that we'll have a woman come in and she says, I have a hormone balance issue. I think I have estrogen dominance. But when we look at testing, let's say we do run a Dutch test, or she's already had a Dutch test run, and she comes in and she's like, I know I have estrogen dominance, but my test shows me that I actually have low estrogen. Well, this specific mycotoxin acts like estrogen in the body. And so it talks to the feedback loop with the brain and presents similarly in terms of symptoms. And as a result, what happens is the brain actually downregulates the production of natural estradiol or estrogen, meaning that you're going to have symptoms of that, but you're going to struggle to develop follicles at the appropriate rate and the appropriate health for ovulation to occur, and that whole hormone domino effect. So as a result, we see a lot of women who have hormonal imbalances that are actually directly being impacted by ZEN. And it gets missed a lot of times because we think of it as only a hormone issue when it's actually a mold issue.
Definitely. And what about other symptoms that are also associated with it as well outside of that estrogen dominance?
Yeah. A lot of times we'll see some GI issues. So often this looks like constipation. Not uncommon for us to see motility slow down or have some really stubborn constipation because of the way that the motor migratory complex is impacted by mycotoxins. But we can also see the immune system be compromised. And this doesn't have to be a severe compromise. So I think a lot of times when we think about somebody being immunocompromised, we're thinking about somebody who is always sick, or their white blood cell count is incredibly low, where we're starting to be concerned about other big, scary immune issues. And that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just that the immune system is downregulated and it's having a hard time actually mounting an appropriate response to pathogens or viruses or whatever it is. And so we can see that often on blood work that things are just a little bit more compromised than they should be because the body is attempting to deal with this fungal pathogen.
And it can just be zearalenone, or it could also be, oftentimes we're seeing that it's multiple mycotoxins or maybe a couple others that somebody's also dealing with as well. But just for the purpose of this podcast, since we're talking about how it relates to fertility, what are some of your primary supports that you like to use if somebody is dealing with ZN, and how would you like to implement them?
Yeah. It usually requires a good amount of liver support in particular. So making sure that all three phases of liver detoxification are being supported. So that's going to include bile production, but also phase 2 detoxification from an herbal perspective. And then of course, elimination via the bowels can be really crucial for actually removing this. But it's also going to require that we talk about where it's coming from. as well. And this is one of the trickier molds because a lot of times when we talk about mold, we are talking about an environment-based mold. Yep. And that's not the case with this one, unfortunately. This is actually a mycotoxin, and the mold comes from improperly stored grains. So things like rice and oats are some of the primary sources. So what we often find is that women have really clean diets. They don't eat gluten. They're not eating wheat, but they are eating a lot of rice and a lot of oats in their place. And they're being exposed to these mycotoxins that are taking hold and colonizing their body that are causing issues. Not only from like a fertility perspective, we know that ZEN can impact and create a risk for miscarriages, but also creating this susceptibility to just have a hard time actually getting that positive pregnancy test in the first place.
Mm-hmm. I'm so happy that you mentioned that part about ZEN being found also in contaminated foods, particularly grains, because I actually just got off a new client call with somebody just a couple hours ago. And new client came in with mold testing, high zearalenine, and also very sensitive to grains, like cannot tolerate them. And so just that making that connection again is just so important because we do often think of these different ones that we can be exposed to in our environment, but food is part of that. And like we can reduce our exposure to what it is that we are consuming as well. So I love that you mentioned that. And something else that I've seen you chat about also on your social media platforms, on your podcast, is really focusing in on antifungals and immune modulators when we're really honing in on detoxing the body from mold. So can you elaborate on that and why that is so important to incorporate in somebody's regimen?
Yeah, let's start with the immune modulators. So when I'm thinking about immune modulator, I'm thinking about something that is modulating the immune system, meaning that it's not upregulating it in particular. So often we know that mold and mycotoxins are immunotoxic. They can compromise the immune system, but what we also often see is that there can be some type of immune dysregulation. So, in our fertility practice, we can see this, but it's a lot more common that we actually see this in pediatrics, where children are having an upregulated response to things. So a lot of times this will look like children who have a lot of allergies as a result of mold exposure, whether that's in utero or like a current exposure. And it's just that their immune system is kind of panicking and trying to mount a response to something. And what modulators are going to do is not upregulate that response, but it's going to allow the immune system to have an appropriate response. So a lot of the immune modulators that I really like to use are coming from things like mushrooms, which are a fungus in and of themselves. Things like reishi and cordyceps can really give the immune system kind of a backboard of, we're going to have a response, but let's calm down a little bit, but we don't want to compromise the immune system. Oftentimes in an immune system that is being impacted by mold, it can swing back and forth where there's a compromised state, but it's having an upregulated response. And so we want something to kind of be that Goldilocks rule, or similar to the way that adaptogenic herbs work, to actually modulate it and match what the client needs. And then in terms of antifungals, I think that this can be missed a lot of times. So the way that I usually explain this is whether there is something that's passed in utero or not, or if it's a current exposure, there's likely a fungus that is residing in the body. So when it's a current exposure, mold is a fungus, it produces spores, we inhale those spores, and then it starts to colonize and live within the sinuses and the GI tract. The same is true if that happened to mom, and now it got passed in utero and you started day one with that fungus in your body, knowing that we transfer the microbiome in its entirety to our children. And while we certainly do want to be selecting binders specific to the mycotoxins that are being excreted, we also want to be sure that we're addressing colonization. So the binders are a crucial component, but they are often not enough to actually do eradication of that fungus that's living somewhere in the body. So using antifungals in the GI tract in particular, or in the sinuses, can be incredibly important for making sure that this issue doesn't come back again in the future. And it often does take some time. It just depends on the severity of the case and the total tox burden there.
Awesome. And, something that came on my radar about a couple of years ago were paraprobiotics to help with immune modulating. And I'm curious because I also love using, sources from mushrooms like reishi and supports like that as well. But I have found success with using paraprobiotics as well. I'm just curious if you have tried that with your patients yet or have found success with it.
You know what? I haven't, honestly.
Okay. Yeah. It's cool because they're basically a dead form of a live strain. So it's not boosting the immune system, which is what we're trying to not do for these individuals that are dealing with, very hyperactive immune system. So yeah, found it to be super helpful and just curious if you've seen success with it. But, something you've also mentioned, and I'm glad that you are diving into the piece with the antifungals because it's so important to really be addressing colonization in somebody dealing with mold toxicity. But you did mention how mold can make heavy metals more toxic on a post. And I would love for you to elaborate on that because it's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's not uncommon that we see both of these come up. And this is why I like knowing what the metal burden is in addition to the mycotoxin burden, because they do interact with one another. So yeast and fungus can actually start to methylate certain heavy metals. So the easiest one to explain this with is mercury. So essentially what happens is it will take inorganic mercury and convert it to a form called methyl mercury, which is more toxic and can actually accumulate more within the body. Now, these methyl mercuries are lipophilic, meaning that they're fat soluble and they can cross the blood-brain barrier. They can be stored in adipose tissue. But as that starts to happen, it can cause more issues as the body attempts to sequester it in these fatty tissues. But then beyond that, when we're thinking about the fact that mold and mycotoxins can impact the GI tract, they can cause intestinal permeability. That means that when we're exposed to things like heavy metals, they are going to be more dangerous because they can go directly through those barriers in the GI tract into the bloodstream and cause immune issues. If we're being exposed to mold, we know that beneficial bacteria are likely in a compromised or insufficient state, and those are really important for the detoxification of metals. So it makes it very difficult to actually then bind to and excrete these things. So it's all connected, and it's one of those things where when there is more than one toxin exposure or accumulation, they kind of work off of each other, and it's unfortunately like a very vicious cycle.
Yes, absolutely. And kind of continuing on the topic of then getting into gut dysbiosis, leaky gut, candida overgrowth, like those all being also a driving factor behind infertility. And I'm sure you see a lot of this in your practice. We know certain molds, again, can contribute to that colonization and also heavy metals. And you talk a lot about that as well. So can you share the connection between candida and heavy metals?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually thinking about this earlier when you were talking a little bit about how this indirectly impacts fertility. So there are pathogens in the gut, candida being one of them, and it's a normal pathogen that resides in everybody, and we want to keep it in normal levels. But we also know that these pathogens have protective mechanisms, being that they are reliant on us as their hosts. And candida in particular can actually metabolize heavy metals in an attempt to break them down. So when we see high levels of candida on something like stool testing, the way that I approach that is, why is this happening? Maybe there has been a mold exposure that's worth considering. But when there's not, the next thing that I'm thinking about is heavy metals that are essentially feeding candida in the GI tract and causing issues. So we see this with candida for sure, but we can also see this with other pathogens, even things like bacterial overgrowths. Bacteria is kind of the cleanup crew. So we know that there's species like Pseudomonas that are actually metabolizing things like glyphosate. So if we see Pseudomonas at elevated levels, why is that happening? The same can be true of things like parasites. Why are they overgrowing in the first place? Knowing that they should and do normally reside in our GI tract, there's a reason that we're seeing those overgrowth issues.
Okay, I love that you elaborated on that. Thank you. And so kind of diving further into the different environmental chemicals that we can be exposed to that can be causing issues of fertility and just other symptoms in our body as well. But you also talk about plastics as well. So can you talk about why these can be so detrimental to our hormones, affecting fertility, and like what are some of our biggest exposures potentially that we're getting in ways we can maybe avoid that?
Yeah. One of the biggest ones that I often see come up is BPA. and it can impact fertility in a lot of different ways. One of the things that we had done as a practice is we had gone through all of the toxin testing for women who had came in with hormonal concerns or with a goal of conceiving, whether they were actively trying or not. And BPA was actually one of the top things that came back. So 15% of women that we've worked with had elevated levels of BPA. And it can cause a whole host of issues. It can create a risk for miscarriage. It can act as an endocrine disruptor and mimic estrogen in a lot of ways. And we know that it's going to impact GI health as a whole as well. So yes, we want to be thinking about, these type of plastics. Where are we currently being exposed in our lives? This can be everything from Tupperware, drinking out of plastic water bottles. But it can also be things that we might not realize, being that plastic is everywhere at the end of the day. And some of these things are within our control, and some of them aren't. So a lot of the food and the produce and the meat that we purchase is wrapped in plastic at the end of the day. Even cans, if you're eating out of, canned food, has plastic and BPA within it. Things like receipts have BPA. And so we're being exposed at all times. And that's why we're really thinking about the cumulative effect of all of these exposures and just thinking about where we can reduce toxin exposure where we can. So if it means rather than storing food in plastic, storing it in glass or ceramic instead. Making sure that when we're cooking things, we're doing it in a safe way. What we're drinking our water out of, that we're storing it in an appropriate container. Being mindful of touching things like receipts. I'm certainly not going to be somebody who says I never have touched a receipt in the past several years, because that's certainly not true. It's hard to avoid these things, but we want to be thinking about where those exposure sources are and reducing them as much as we can.
I had read a study, it was a year or two ago, about when it came to plastics that, and BPA phthalates, that by reducing your exposure, you can significantly reduce the toxic burden in your body, because they can get excreted out of a body within something like 3 to 5 days, or up to a week or something. But you mentioned the things that we can't control. Now, this isn't to provide any sort of, fear mongering around the fact that we're always around. That's not what you were doing. But again, there are so many things in our environment that we just unfortunately can't control anymore. So with supporting somebody that is dealing with high levels of plastics, maybe they have done a lot of these different supports. Do you typically see if that's showing up on their urine testing, that potentially it's due to clogged up detoxification pathways? Are there certain supports that you're looking to, supporting the liver, supporting the kidneys, that you help to see good results in maybe flushing this out of their system?
Yeah. So, to your point, I do always cover a current exposure. Where can we reduce exposures? And, I've seen a lot of people who have accumulated levels, even if they haven't done or been exposed to things for a long time. So there was a woman who I had just seen something recently who we had worked with, and she was sharing on her social media that when we had done the toxin testing with her, a lot of the toxin burden that came up had actually come from where she had lived during childhood, because it was very specific to that area, rather than where she has been living for all of her adulthood. And so when I'm looking at toxin testing, I'm looking for patterns ultimately. So we know that certain toxins go down specific detoxification pathways, specifically thinking about phase 2 detox in the liver. And so it's not uncommon that we'll see patterns in the toxin burden that somebody has. So for instance, glucuronidation is one of the phase 2 detox pathways. We know that mold can impact this, but it's also responsible for the detoxification of lots of different chemicals and metals. And so if we're looking at this and we see, this chemical goes down glucuronidation and this one goes down glucuronidation, it tells us that somebody might just inherently have more of an impaired capacity down that pathway. And that might be something that they want to think about long-term for support. A lot of that can be done through diet. It doesn't always have to be through supplementation or doing more of a therapeutic approach. But I think when you have that information about the way that your body works, it just allows you to support detoxification long-term as well.
Definitely. And this kind of brings in, the different environmental chemicals that we've been talking about, such as plastics or, other things that are in plastics and environmental chemical stuff that we're using on a daily basis, such as fragrances and things like that. But also, again, mold toxicity and heavy metals. And I actually saved this question towards the end because I didn't want to ask you about how you might support somebody through heavy metals, because you're saying, you're kind of seeing what's like this order that we might need to support this person in. And so where along the line, like, where will you like support, like, let's just say we see, like, let's talk about mold and heavy metals. Like, what are you like considering supporting first? Like, is there an order that you like to like support somebody in that you found best benefits for?
Yeah. I think there is an order that I usually see work best for most people. And that is to address heavy metals before mold. But a lot of that is also preceded by supporting somebody's inherent ability to do detoxification work through the liver and kidneys in particular. So we have to be supporting that, and it needs to be happening throughout. So that can often mean that there are, lifestyle interventions or certain supplementation that stay in place throughout an entire protocol, so that when we get to the point where we're moving metals, we're ensuring that they're being eliminated properly and not being re-sequestered somewhere else in the body where they're going to cause damage. The reason why I tend to do it that way is knowing that if I'm going to be addressing mold using antifungals as well as binders, when we go after the candida at the end, being that it's going to be metabolizing heavy metals, I want to reduce that feeding source as much as possible before we get there. Now, that doesn't mean that there might need to be additional work for heavy metals long term. I think unfortunately in some ways social media has made heavy metal detoxification feel like this very easy, fast thing that can happen, and that's not always the case. So it might be more of like, we get some drainage and detoxification support in place. If we're thinking about any pathogen burden, we want to consider that at some point in this conversation as well. But then starting to support heavy metal elimination, getting into the mold side of things, and those things are ultimately layering on top of each other rather than being in a silo.
Yes, definitely. And again, too, like you're mentioning, like when you're supporting through foods and maybe some supplementation or supports that are supporting the liver and kidneys, like those are indirectly then helping the body to start to excrete some of these things out too. And so then it's that layering effect where then you can like kind of go in and support with the heavy metals and the mold and other supports that you want to do and just kind of go back and forth and helping reduce that body toxic burden. And to talk about testing, is there any particular testing that you have found great in terms of identifying like this heavy burden that can be on someone's body?
Yeah, we like to use the total tox urinalysis from Vibrant Wellness.
Yeah.
That's our go-to test. It's not a perfect test. It is an excretion test. So this is ultimately what you are actively excreting via the urinary tract. So you can miss things. So, part of how I missed this very initially with myself is I did a toxin test on myself. No metals came up. But when I did an HTMA test, which is a hair tissue mineral analysis, then we saw the mercury coming through hair excretion. Those are two very different tests ultimately. And they're two great ways to kind of see both sides of the coin in terms of a current exposure that's maybe happening or a very significant excretion that your body is doing a good job of eliminating toxins. But for somebody, particularly on the heavy metal side, just knowing that the urinary tract is not the primary place that the body is normally excreting it, doing something like an HTMA test, especially if you're just still not getting the answers you're looking for, and you know that there's a heavy metal issue, as there was in my case. I took that total tox when I still had the amalgam fillings and nothing came up. Well, I know I'd have an exposure.
Right.
So, sometimes it just needs to be a comprehensive approach to figuring out every excretion route.
That's such a valid point to bring up because, again, the body can also the body is always just trying to protect us. So it's doing a job of trying to sequester and hold on to some of these components, right? Even if we're trying to provoke, because if it lets the floodgates open, we are not going to be feeling very good. So, again, on like these urine tests, there are different tests. Like sometimes we just don't get even though we know, like you said, there is an exposure, the body is so smart and it's trying to protect us. So sometimes I've seen plenty of negative urine mycotoxin testing in my time now. And I know that there is a mold issue. So, and same thing with heavy metals. So again, too, I think that was a really great point to bring up is that if you're not getting the answers on one test, you can do another test. We can do other things to try to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no perfect testing, unfortunately. Yeah. And every test is going to miss something. It's just, and I think, looking at other tests can be helpful. And then also thinking about symptom presentations. Yes. The thing that I always explain is data is so important for us as clinicians, and people are way more than a set of test results. So their experiences, people, and the symptoms that they are noticing on a daily basis, when combined with that type of data, can be incredibly helpful for putting all the pieces of the puzzle together.
definitely. I love that. Absolutely. So thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. This was absolutely amazing. I know so many of my listeners are just going to find this so supportive and helpful. And I love all the incredible information you gave. So I'd love to kind of leave the floor to you. If there was anything else that you wanted to cover that maybe you thought about during the interview that you wanted to mention, or where people can find you and work with you as well.
Yeah. The biggest thing I think I'll leave it with is I feel like toxin burden is contributing to a lot of what we're seeing as clinicians from a functional perspective. And I love that there are so many people who are starting to talk more about this. And I know how overwhelming it can be as well, where it feels like everything is hurting me. And so I'm a very big advocate of control the controllables. We know that we are all going to be exposed to toxins in our modern world. That is never going to change. It's probably going to get worse. But there are a lot of things that we can do in our personal lives to make a difference in what we're being exposed to on a regular basis. So it doesn't have to be this big, scary thing. It can be slowly over time. None of us are perfect. Even those of us who are talking about toxins are still being exposed to things. And just knowing that that's part of the human experience at the end of the day. But you guys can find me. I'm on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Reversing Infertility. And our website is always-growing.com. Our practice is Always Growing Wellness. We work with women in the preconception phase, both women and men. But then we also work with pediatrics. As I shared my son's story, it ended up being a really big part of our practice that a lot of other kids needed support in this space. So we really are very lucky to be able to support both sides of the coin and make sure that as we're supporting couples starting their families or growing their families, we're also thinking about the health of the next generation as well.
Oh, well, thank you, Deidre. Thank you for being a guest and for the work that you're doing, for the amazing work you're doing, for getting the information out there and being active on your platforms just to help provide people with more insight into why they might be struggling with fertility or just symptoms that are unexplainable in general. So like you said, there's a lot of us talking about it now, and I'm excited to continue to see this community grow because it's so important to just get this information out there. So thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.